I'm going to shoot a series of clips on research, particularly on empirical research in the social sciences, but there may be parallels to other disciplines as well. In this first video, let me outline what a report on empirical research in these disciplines look like. The research report, by and large, comprises 5 sections. There's the introduction, there's a theory section, there's a section on data and methodology, there's a section that presents the findings of the research, and there's a conclusion and discussion section. As to the introduction starts with the problem, and that is the managerial or the governmental problem. That's an issue that exists in the real world. You abstract from that problem towards an academic problem, and you do this by briefly summarizing what is known about the issue already in the literature. Then you describe what is not known yet in the literature. So why should you do this research? What is lacking in research today that prevents us from answering, from helping the outside party solving the problem? If there is, for example, a problem in universities on how to deal with student well-being in the context of COVID-19, then that is a problem. Literature may prescribe something about effective or less effective interventions in regular terms, but you may argue we do not know whether these are also effective in COVID times. So there's a problem, there's an issue with student well-being, there's something that we already know, but we don't know something as well, and that is then what the problem is like in times of COVID. Then the gap between the two is where you will contribute to the literature, and these are the contributions that you will make. You develop research questions, and there's another video about research questions. Research questions that guide you in answering the problem, that ensure that you meet the contribution that you've made. After formulating the research question, you describe the empirical setup, also in brief. In what context was the study set? In what type of data were you studying? Perhaps even the methodology, if that is a distinctive one. And then you formulate the contributions that you have in mind. So what new things, what novel aspects of the research should the literature be looking for? Now it depends a bit on the type of paper that you are writing, what ambitions you should have. Of course, with the PhD paper, these ambitions will be far more developed than those that are relevant for a bachelor thesis or an undergraduate term paper. Alright, so that is then the part on the introduction. The chapter thereafter is about theory, and basically this includes 2 components. You review what is known about the problem already, and you develop hypotheses, testable expectations about the specific contributions that you want to make. Reviewing the literature revolves around summarizing the perspectives, so the theories that are relevant. If you're talking about interventions, there may be theories from clinical psychology that inform you what relevant perspectives on student well-being you can adopt. But it could also be that there are perspectives in the field of education sciences that are relevant. And you may even imagine that a field like economics has something to say about what motivates students to, for example, attend classes. You not only summarize the theories, but also the findings in prior work. So there are related studies that worked on topics similar to yours, and you report on the findings in these studies. This part relates to the summary of earlier work, what do we know, in the introduction. Then you continue to develop hypotheses or expectations, which are pretty much your sub-questions in statement form. offering student coaching sessions improves student well-being. So these are testable hypotheses that you can answer when analyzing relevant data on the material. These hypotheses thus relate to what we do not know, as it was discussed in the introduction. So there are clearly connections between the introduction and the theory section here. At the end of the theory section, you will have the set of hypotheses, and you will continue in the remainder of the thesis or in the remainder of the research project to test these hypotheses. In some fields, you will see this a bit differently. In economics, you would expect less hypotheses but more of a model building exercise at the end, where you try to add your novelty to an existing mathematical model and work out the details of that model. In psychology, you would expect the introduction and the theory section to be merged into one section that is called introduction, but by and large the components of the research as I've described in here apply, although they may be named somewhat differently. In the data and method section, you continue to describe the data. You start at the very high level. What population did you intend to reach out to in your work? Perhaps this is the population of students in universities, if you want to study, if you stick to the well-being example. Then you describe how you got to the data that you in the end work with. So these are the sampling procedures. How did you sample from this population? Is it a convenient sample? Is it a random sample? How did you ensure that the sample that you obtained is more or less, or at least is intended to be representative of the population that you want to study? Because if you have a representative sample, then the conclusions can also apply to the population. Then you will describe more about the procedures, the variables that you have used. If you work with questionnaires, what was the wording of these questions? Where did you take them from? Was this earlier research, or did you need to develop your own instrument? And if so, how did you go about that? Then you have described all the details about data collection, and you continue to describe the details about the methodology, the method that you used to estimate the relationships. This may be a regression analysis, a correlation analysis, cluster or factor analysis. There are multiple possibilities, and it really depends on how commonly used these methods are, what you should report on them, how extensive you should be here. Then we have the expectations from the theory section and the data, or at least the report on how you got the data. In the data and method section, you can move on to section 4, which is about the results. This is where you describe the findings of your work. It's always good to start with a description of the data. What does the sample look like? That gives you an indication of how representative the sample may be for the population at large. It may show groups that are overrepresented or underrepresented in your population. For example, if you would distribute your survey in a particular group of students, say when you approach a particular engineering program, you may have male students overrepresented. In another program, you may have relatively few or relatively more international students. And the conclusions that you may then draw about their well-being may generalize less to those groups that are not as much represented in your sample. Alright, then from the descriptives you move on to correlations, so the bivariate relationships. What relationships do we find in the study? By and large, you would like to have strong relationships between the dependent and the independent variables of your study, relatively weak relationships among the dependent variables, and also relatively weak relationships among the independent variables. And why that is, that's an entirely different topic. And then you move on to testing the hypotheses with the statistical methodology that you have explained in the data and method section. Do you find supporting evidence for the findings? Or do your findings reject the expectations that you had? Do you perhaps need to perform sensitivity analysis, try to tweak a bit the findings? Maybe the results hold for some group in your population but not for another. Maybe there were some alternative ways of measuring a particular variable. You can try them both. That adds to the robustness of your findings. And then you get to the conclusion in chapter 5. The conclusion summarizes the entirety of the thesis. It starts with a summary of the problem statement that you take from the introduction. It continues with a summary of the approach, so the summary of the hypotheses that you have developed. And then it contrasts the findings with the expectations that you have formulated beforehand. And you then reflect, which is called the discussion, on the quality of the findings. Perhaps you didn't find evidence that confirms your expectations. Why could that be? Is there a limitation perhaps in your study that made it difficult to draw this conclusion? Do you maybe not have enough data? Or is a certain group not represented? Or do you, with the benefit of hindsight, have an idea of why the mechanism that you thought would apply doesn't apply after all? Also, if you do find confirmatory evidence, then still you can look into the question of how robust these findings are. Would there not be alternative mechanisms that lead to the same expectation? If you think that a particular treatment, for example, that you have studied, so suppose you wanted to study student well-being, you designed your own intervention, which involved coaching sessions, and these coaching sessions indeed, as you observed, led to a decrease led to an increase in student well-being. And you may say, well, my intervention worked. But it may also be that just the fact that the students got out of their house to campus to attend your sessions put them in another mindset, and that already did the thing. So are there alternative explanations that would generate the same findings that you did? And can you then think of, whether you found corroborating evidence or not, alternative settings in which you could then test these? So, in the example that I just gave, you could continue in follow-up research, or others could, by implementing such coaching sessions in their students' home, so as to cancel out the effect of them traveling to you already producing an effect. Alright, and in the end you then come up with proposals how future research could build on the findings of your work. Now there are a couple of connections that we've already discussed between the different components of the report. First, there's, on each of the slides that are presented, a vertical path that starts, for example, in the introduction from the problem to what we know, what we don't know, what our question is, etc. So within each of the sections there's a radiological structure. But also across sections we see that the part in the introduction, what we already know about the problem, relates to the literature review. And the literature review also produces the definition of variables. It informs how in earlier research variables were operationalized, what samples were identified, what methods were used. And that then is part of, in the discussion, the comparison of your findings against the body of literature. In the introduction you also developed a contribution part, what we don't know yet. That relates to your hypothesis development, which you then, in the results section, test. So you test the hypothesis that you have formulated. And then that is the other component of the comparison of what you expected to find and what you in the end found. And to close the circle of research, the suggestions for future research that you make may serve as input for projects after you to continue their research, just like you could build your research on suggestions for future research as you found them in other places.